In the summer of 2019, a routine highway expansion project in Nevada's Esmeralda Valley ground to a halt. Not because of budget overruns or environmental protests, but because the ground itself refused to cooperate with reality. You're looking at survey data that shouldn't exist, elevation readings that change by the hour, laser measurements that contradict themselves across identical points. When the Nevada Department of Transportation hired structural analyst Dr. Marcus Webb to investigate what they assumed were equipment malfunctions, he discovered something far more unsettling. The valley wasn't just difficult to measure, it was geometrically unstable. What began as an engineering puzzle evolved into one of the most thoroughly documented spatial anomalies in modern history. A case where the laws of physics appeared to bend around a discovery that would force scientists to reconsider what might be watching us from beneath our feet. This is the story of the town where the sky bent, and the buried structure that may have been bending it for centuries. Chapter 1. The Impossible Survey. Data Dr. Marcus Webb arrived at the Esmeralda Valley worksite on June 14th, expecting to spend a few days recalibrating faulty equipment. He'd built a career solving precisely these kinds of problems: laser theodolites throwing aberrant readings, GPS coordinates drifting due to atmospheric interference, total stations requiring firmware updates. In 23 years of civil engineering consulting, he'd never encountered an instrument error he couldn't explain. The first anomaly appeared in the site's baseline control network. Survey crews had established reference points across the valley using standard differential GPS techniques, each monument positioned with centimetre-level accuracy. But when they returned to verify measurements 3 days later, the elevations had changed. Not by millimetres, which might indicate settling or thermal expansion, but by 7 to 12 centimetres across multiple stations simultaneously. Webb's initial hypothesis was straightforward: seasonal groundwater fluctuations causing subsidence. But the geology didn't support it. Esmeralda Valley sat atop ancient volcanic tuff and compacted sediment that hadn't shifted measurably in millennia. More troubling, the elevation changes weren't consistent. Some reference points rose while adjacent ones fell, with no pattern correlating to subsurface conditions or surface loading. He ordered a complete resurvey using independent equipment. 3 different laser scanning systems, operated by separate crews who couldn't compare notes, all returned identical results. The valley floor was exhibiting spatial variability that repeated on roughly 90-minute cycles. At 8 a.m, a given point might register at 1,247.832 meters above sea level. By 9:30 a.m, the same point measured 1,247.905 meters. By 11 a.m, it had returned to baseline. This wasn't instrument error. This was measurement of something genuinely changing. Webb brought in gravimetric equipment, sensitive instruments that detect minute variations in gravitational acceleration. The data they returned made him recalibrate 3 times before accepting it as accurate. Gravity readings across the valley showed localized fluctuations of plus or minus 15 milligaules, oscillating in the same 90-minute pattern. For context, driving from sea level to the top of a modest hill produces gravity changes of about 50 milligaules over a mile. But these variations were occurring across distances of less than 200 meters, with no corresponding change in elevation or subsurface mass. The valley wasn't eroding or settling. Space itself, in localized pockets, was experiencing periodic compression and expansion. The measurements weren't wrong. Reality was fluctuating. By July, the highway project had been indefinitely suspended, but the investigation had only just begun. Chapter 2. The first visual anomaly. Sarah Kellerman, a heavy equipment operator with 16 years of field experience, was the first to report seeing something wrong with the sky. On July 22nd, during a scheduled break, she watched a commercial airliner cross the valley at cruising altitude, except it didn't cross normally. As the aircraft moved from west to east, its fuselage appeared to stretch and compress like an image viewed through warped glass. She initially dismissed it as heat shimmer, the familiar mirage effect caused by thermal gradients near hot ground. But the distortion followed the aircraft across the entire visible sky, and the day was overcast, with temperatures barely reaching 75 degrees Fahrenheit. When she pointed it out to her crew, 3 other workers confirmed they saw it too. Planes passing overhead looked geometrically wrong, depending on viewing angle. Webb arranged for high-speed cameras to be positioned at multiple locations around the valley. Over the next week, they captured 37 commercial flights traversing the airspace above the worksite. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed consistent optical distortion. Aircraft appeared compressed along their vertical axis when viewed from certain positions, stretched horizontally from others, and occasionally seemed to exhibit both effects simultaneously across different sections of the fuselage. The critical detail, air traffic control radar, showed normal flight paths. The planes weren't actually changing shape or trajectory. Something between the observer and the aircraft was bending light itself. Webb contacted Dr. Alicia Torres, an atmospheric physicist from UC Berkeley, who specialized in optical phenomena. She arrived with spectrometers and atmospheric profiling equipment, expecting to document some unusual refraction pattern caused by localized air density variations. Instead, her instruments detected something unprecedented. Light passing through specific columns of air above the valley was experiencing angular deflection consistent with gravitational lensing. The same effect observed around massive celestial objects, like black holes or galaxy clusters. But those phenomena require enormous masses warping spacetime itself. The atmospheric distortions above Esmeralda Valley were occurring in the absence of any visible mass concentration. Torres ran the calculations multiple times. To produce the observed optical effects through gravitational lensing would require a mass equivalent to several thousand tons concentrated in mid-air, something that was obviously impossible. Yet the spectroscopic data was unambiguous. Light was being bent by gravity, not by atmospheric refraction. The valley wasn't just geometrically unstable, it was gravitationally anomalous in ways that defied every model of physics they could apply, and the distortions were growing stronger. Chapter 3. The Bent Horizon. By early August, the optical anomalies had become visible to anyone entering the valley. The horizon itself appeared wrong. Stand at the eastern edge of the work site and look west, and the distant mountains seemed to curve upward at their peaks, as if viewed through a fisheye lens. Turn around, and the effect reversed. The western horizon bowed downward. Webb's team conducted a systematic photographic survey using calibrated cameras with known optical properties. They mounted high-resolution sensors on fixed tripods, carefully leveled, and photographed the same sightlines repeatedly across different times of day and atmospheric conditions. The results were consistent and deeply unsettling. The curvature wasn't lens distortion. Multiple camera systems with completely different optics all captured identical geometric warping. The effect persisted regardless of focal length, sensor size or manufacturer. Independent analysis by optical engineers confirmed the cameras were functioning perfectly. What they were recording was actual geometric distortion of the landscape itself, or more precisely, of the space containing the landscape. More disturbing, the degree of curvature correlated directly with the gravimetric oscillations Webb had first documented. When gravity readings spiked, the horizon bent more severely. During gravitational troughs, the landscape appeared nearly normal. Whatever was causing the spatial fluctuations was intensifying. Dr. Torres proposed a radical hypothesis. If a localized region of enhanced gravity existed somewhere in or beneath the valley, it would create what physicists call a gravity well, a depression in the fabric of space-time itself. Light traveling through that depression would curve, just as it does around massive stars. Observers looking across the gravity well would see the landscape beyond it appearing warped, exactly as photographed. But where was the mass? Torres brought in magnetometers and ground-penetrating radar to search for some buried high-density object, perhaps a meteorite or unusual mineral deposit that might explain the gravitational anomaly. The magnetic surveys detected nothing unusual. The ground-penetrating radar, however, found something extraordinary. At a depth of approximately 6 meters, extending across nearly 400 meters of valley floor, was a buried structure exhibiting near-perfect reflectivity to radar waves. Its edges formed a precise geometric circle, and it appeared to be completely hollow. The excavation began on August 19th. Chapter 4. The Abandoned Installation. The first piece of the structure emerged from the desert soil like a bone from ancient earth. Not corroded metal, not weathered stone, but something that looked as though it had been buried yesterday, despite sediment layers that would take centuries to accumulate above it. The excavation required 3 weeks. Standard earth-moving equipment worked the overburden, but as crews approached the structure itself, they switched to careful hand tools and brushes, treating it like an archaeological site, because that's exactly what it had become. What they uncovered defied every expectation. A ring, perfectly circular, measuring 412 meters in diameter, composed of a material that looked like brushed titanium, but responded to analysis like nothing in any materials database. The structure had no visible seams, no welds, no joints of any kind. It appeared to have been formed as a single continuous piece, which should have been metallurgically impossible for something this large. The cross-section was equally strange, a hollow, toroidal shape, roughly 2 meters in diameter, forming the ring's body. But unlike a simple torus, the surface exhibited complex geometric patterns. Channels and ridges spiraled around the structure's circumference in mathematical progressions that engineers recognized as having properties related to electromagnetic waveguides and resonant cavities. Most unsettling was what happened when they tried to sample it. Diamond-tipped drill bits skated off the surface without leaving a mark. Industrial plasma cutters produced light and heat, but no material removal. Even experimental laser ablation systems borrowed from Los Alamos National Laboratory failed to damage the structure. Whatever it was made of, it exceeded the hardness and heat resistance of any known engineered material. Dr. Alan Chen, a metallurgist from MIT, spent 4 days running every non-destructive test available. X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy detected titanium, niobium, and several other transition metals, but in ratios that shouldn't form stable alloys. Neutron radiography revealed internal structures, thousands of hair-thin channels running through the ring's body, connecting in networks that looked disturbingly, like integrated circuits, except at a scale suggesting capabilities far beyond conventional electronics. The structure was clearly artificial, but it had been buried beneath sediment layers that geological dating placed at more than 300 years old, possibly much older, and it was technological in ways that suggested manufacturing techniques humanity had not yet achieved. Chen filed a preliminary report with 3 words that would define everything that followed: origin unknown, technology advanced. The ring wasn't just an artifact, it appeared to be a machine, and based on the gravitational anomalies still pulsing through the valley, it seemed to still be running. Chapter 5: Electromagnetic Interference. The first electronic failure occurred on September 3rd, when a worker's 2-way radio emitted a burst of static and went silent. He assumed dead batteries. Then 3 more radios failed within an hour, followed by 2 smartphones, a GPS unit, and the digital display on a surveying instrument, all within a 100-meter radius of the excavated ring. Web-ordered comprehensive electromagnetic monitoring. The data revealed something remarkable. The structure was emitting tightly focused pulses of radio frequency energy across multiple bands simultaneously. Not random noise, but structured signals that repeated in complex patterns every 27 minutes. Compasses behaved strangely near the ring. Rather than pointing north, they spun slowly or indicated directions that shifted depending on where you stood relative to the structure. Magnetometer readings showed the ring was generating a rotating magnetic field, cycling through orientations as if scanning or transmitting in different directions sequentially. The most dramatic effect involved drone operations. Webb's team had been using commercial quadcopters to photograph the excavation site from overhead. On September 8th, a drone flying at 30 meters altitude directly above the ring suddenly transmitted corrupted video. The feed showed the landscape below, appearing to twist and fold, as if the camera were looking through a funhouse mirror. Then the drone's GPS failed. Its altimeter displayed impossible readings, and the operator lost control. The drone didn't crash. Instead, it hung motionless in mid-air for 17 seconds, hovering with no control input, before abruptly resuming normal flight and landing safely. The recovered flight logs showed something extraordinary. During those 17 seconds, the drone's internal sensors recorded gravitational acceleration of 1.4 g downward, significantly higher than Earth's surface gravity of 1.0 g. Dr. Torres ran the calculations. If the ring was generating a localized gravity field strong enough to affect aircraft above it, the energy requirements would be immense, requiring power sources that exceeded anything conventional physics could explain. Yet infrared imaging showed the structure at ambient temperature. No heat signature, no energy input, just constant pulsing electromagnetic activity and gravitational effects that shouldn't be possible. The Federal Aviation Administration issued a temporary flight restriction over the valley, establishing a no-fly zone extending to 18,000 feet. Official reason? Unexplained navigational hazards pending investigation. But the real reason was documented in classified briefings. The ring was projecting some form of field that could manipulate gravity itself, and no one knew whether it was increasing in strength or if an aircraft could safely traverse it. The valley had become a no-fly zone, not because of what might fly into it, but because of what might already be there, watching the sky through a lens made of warped space. Chapter 6: The Gravity Well Hypothesis. Dr. Alicia Torres presented her findings to a closed session of physicists and engineers on September 20th. Her conclusion was as elegant as it was terrifying. The ring wasn't just emitting electromagnetic signals, it was generating a carefully controlled distortion of space-time itself. The evidence was overwhelming. Laser interferometry measurements, the same technique used to detect gravitational waves from colliding black holes, showed minute but consistent warping of space directly above the structure. Light travelling through this region took slightly longer to traverse the same distance than it should, a telltale signature of gravitational time dilation. Torres explained it using an analogy from Einstein's general relativity. Mass curves space-time, the way a bowling ball creates a depression in a stretched rubber sheet. Anything passing through that depression, whether light or matter, follows the curved path. The ring appeared to be artificially creating such a depression, a gravity well, without the corresponding mass that should be required. This explained everything. The surveying errors, spatial measurements changing because the space being measured was literally expanding and contracting, the optical distortions, light from distant objects bending around the gravity well, making the horizon appear curved. The aircraft anomalies, planes crossing the well experiencing brief alterations in gravitational acceleration. But the truly radical implication was what such technology suggested. Creating artificial gravity wells required manipulating the fundamental geometry of space-time, something far beyond humanity's current understanding of physics. The theoretical frameworks existed, proposals for warp drives or gravitational lensing devices, but the engineering was considered centuries away, if possible at all. Yet here was a device buried in the Nevada desert, actively doing it. Dr. Raymond Park, a theoretical physicist from Princeton, proposed what he called the observation platform hypothesis. If an advanced civilization wanted to study Earth without physically landing or maintaining an obvious presence, bending gravity would be ideal. Create a lens that makes distant objects appear closer, or allows observation from oblique angles impossible with conventional optics. The ring might not be transmitting into space, it might be a telescope, pulling distant light toward itself through gravitational curvature, allowing something or someone to watch from positions far beyond where conventional observation would be possible. Park noted the ring's orientation. The geometric center of its gravitational effect pointed not toward any landmark on Earth, but upward, toward a specific region of sky. When mapped to celestial coordinates, the aim point corresponded to a position roughly 74 light-years distant in the direction of the constellation Hydra. Was the ring observing that region, or was it being observed from there? The question hung unanswered as September gave way to October, and the first major event approached. Chapter 7. Aircraft Near Miss. On October 12th, at 3:47 a.m., United Airlines, Flight 1843, a Boeing 737, traveling from San Francisco to Denver, passed through airspace adjacent to the Esmeralda Valley no-fly zone. The aircraft was at 38,000 feet, well above the restricted altitude, following a flight path approved by air traffic control. At exactly 3:47:23 a.m., the crew reported a sudden sensation of falling. Both pilots felt their bodies lift against their seat restraints. The aircraft's cockpit instruments displayed conflicting information. The altimeter showed a rapid descent of 1,200 feet in less than 3 seconds, but the artificial horizon indicated level flight. The autopilot disengaged with a warning chime. First Officer Jennifer Morse later described the experience in testimony to the NTSB. "It felt like we'd dropped, like hitting an air pocket, except the plane itself didn't pitch or roll. Everything looked stable through the windscreen, but my body knew we'd fallen, and the altimeter said we were at 36,800 feet, when moments before, we'd been level at 38,000. Air traffic control radar showed the aircraft maintaining constant altitude throughout the event. Ground-based observers with night vision equipment reported seeing the plane's navigation lights at consistent height. No descent occurred, at least not one visible from the ground or measurable by radar. But the aircraft's internal flight data recorder told a different story. The device, which captures hundreds of parameters dozens of times per second, showed 3 seconds of anomalous readings. Accelerometers detected 1.3 g of gravitational force pulling downward, significantly more than Earth's standard surface gravity. GPS altitude measurements diverged wildly from barometric altitude, as if the two systems were measuring different physical realities simultaneously. Most troubling, the aircraft's weight on wheels sensors, which detect whether landing gear is compressed by the weight of the aircraft, briefly registered positive, as if the plane were sitting on the ground, despite being at cruising altitude. Dr. Torres and her team analysed the flight data against their models of the ring's gravitational field. The correlation was exact. At 3:47:23 am, the ring's gravimetric oscillation reached a peak intensity. Flight 1843 had passed through the outer edge of a gravitational spike that extended far higher than anyone had predicted. The plane hadn't descended. Instead, space itself had compressed vertically beneath it, pulling the aircraft downward in relative terms while maintaining its absolute position. It was spatial displacement, not movement, a phenomenon with no name in aviation safety protocols because it had never occurred before. The FAA expanded the no-fly zone to 45,000 feet and extended its radius to 60 miles. Commercial air traffic was rerouted. Military test ranges in the region were temporarily closed, and physicists began calculating what would happen if the ring's power increased further. The answers were not reassuring. If the gravitational effects continued intensifying, they might eventually produce tidal forces strong enough to stress aircraft structures. At sufficient strength, the gravity well could conceivably tear an aircraft apart simply by creating differential gravitational acceleration between its nose and tail. The ring was escalating, and no one knew how to stop it. Chapter 8: The Ancient Burial Theory. Dr. Patricia Moss, an archaeologist from the University of New Mexico, arrived in late October to examine the sediment layers above the ring. If they could date the burial accurately, it might provide clues about who built it and when. Standard stratigraphic analysis revealed a clear sequence. The ring sat in soil that had accumulated gradually over centuries. Above it lay distinct depositional layers corresponding to known geological events: flood deposits, wind-blown sediments, volcanic ash falls from eruptions whose dates were historically documented. The volcanic ash was particularly useful. Moss identified a layer of tephra matching the chemical signature of the 1666 eruption of Mount Hekla in Iceland, an event that spread ash across the northern hemisphere. This layer sat 12 centimeters above the ring's surface. Below the ring, she found ash from another eruption, Mount Vesuvius, in 79 AD, identifiable by its unique mineral composition. The implications were staggering. The ring had been buried between 79 AD and 1666 AD, a span of nearly 16 centuries. But radiocarbon dating of organic material within the sediments suggested an even earlier burial, potentially predating the Roman Empire entirely. This wasn't a recently lost artifact. The ring had been underground for longer than most modern civilizations had existed. Moss expanded her investigation, searching for any associated artifacts, structures, or evidence of human activity from the burial period. She found nothing. No pottery shards, no tools, no signs of settlement or construction activity. The ring appeared to have been placed or had fallen onto an empty desert floor, then gradually buried by natural processes over centuries. But ground-penetrating radar revealed something else. The ring wasn't sitting on the ancient surface. It was suspended 4 meters above the bedrock by 3 support pillars, also buried, also composed of the same unidentifiable material. The pillars extended downward into volcanic tuff, dated to approximately 25 million years ago, terminating at depths where they appeared to be anchored into the rock itself. This suggested deliberate installation, not accidental burial. Someone or something had placed the ring here intentionally, supporting it on pillars designed to hold it at a specific elevation above the bedrock, then left it to be gradually covered by sediment. Who could have accomplished such engineering in pre-industrial times? The ring weighed an estimated 400 tons based on volume calculations, even before accounting for whatever internal mechanisms powered its effects. Moving and positioning it would have required technology beyond medieval or even early modern capability, unless it hadn't been installed by humans at all. Dr. Chen proposed a possibility that no one wanted to articulate formally. The ring might predate human technological civilization entirely. If it had been placed during a period when this region was uninhabited or before complex societies developed in the Americas, there would be no historical record of its installation. It would simply be here, waiting beneath the soil, until modern construction happened to uncover it. The archaeological evidence couldn't determine who built it, but it could establish that the ring was ancient, deliberately placed, and had been silently operating beneath the desert for longer than written history existed in this hemisphere. The question was, operating for what purpose? And was that purpose about to be fulfilled? Chapter 9. The activation event. October 29th brought an unseasonable storm to Esmeralda Valley. Towering thunderheads built throughout the afternoon, and by 8 p.m, lightning was striking the surrounding peaks every few seconds. Weather stations recorded unusual atmospheric conditions, electromagnetic field strengths far higher than typical storm values, and bizarre barometric pressure fluctuations that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the thunder. At 8:34 p.m, a lightning bolt struck the exposed surface of the ring. The structure absorbed the discharge without damage, but something changed. Instruments positioned around the excavation site registered a sudden surge in electromagnetic activity. The ring's normal radio frequency emissions intensified by a factor of 10, then 20, cycling up through frequencies that extended well into the microwave range. Dr. Torres and her team, monitoring from a trailer 200 meters away, watched their screens fill with data. Magnetometers showed the ring's magnetic field rotating faster, completing a full revolution every 8 seconds instead of the usual 90 minutes. Gravimetric sensors detected the strongest spatial distortion yet recorded. The ground itself appeared to be rising and falling by several centimeters, as if breathing. Then the sky changed. Technicians outside the trailer reported that the clouds directly above the ring were darkening unnaturally, despite the sun having set hours earlier. Not the black of ordinary night, but a void-like darkness, as if light were being pulled into the region rather than scattered by water droplets and dust. Within that darkness, stars became visible, not the familiar constellations seen from the Nevada desert, but sharp, brilliant points of light that appeared during a thunderstorm through clouds, as if the clouds themselves had become transparent or ceased to exist within a specific column of atmosphere. Torres grabbed portable instrumentation and approached as close as safety protocols allowed. What she recorded would be analysed for months afterward. The ring was generating a gravitational lens powerful enough to warp not just light, but the atmosphere itself. Air density within the affected zone was decreasing, not from heating or evacuation, but because the physical space was expanding vertically, stretching the atmosphere thinner. The effect lasted 17 minutes. During that time, anyone looking upward from within the valley saw a circular window to space itself, a region where the sky appeared as it would from orbit, with stars unobscured by atmospheric interference. Spectrographic analysis of light coming through the window detected frequencies normally filtered by ozone and water vapor, confirming that the atmosphere above the ring had temporarily become optically transparent across wavelengths invisible to human eyes. Then, as suddenly as it began, the effect ceased. The darkness faded, the stars vanished behind returning clouds, and the ring's electromagnetic emissions dropped back to baseline levels. The storm continued for another hour before dissipating naturally. But the scientific team knew what they'd witnessed. The ring hadn't just passively created a gravity well, it had actively opened a window through the atmosphere, projecting a clear line of observation from the ground to space. Whether it was looking outward or allowing something to look inward remained an open question. What was certain, the ring had demonstrated capabilities far beyond simple gravitational lensing. It could manipulate atmosphere, bend light across electromagnetic spectrums, and create observational conditions that defied natural atmospheric physics. And it had done so in response to an external energy source, lightning, as if waiting for sufficient power to activate fully. The realization terrified everyone involved. The ring might have been dormant for centuries. Now they'd woken it up. Chapter 10. The Observation Window. Dr. Raymond Park spent the next 3 weeks analysing the astronomical data captured during the activation event. The stars visible through the ring's gravitational window weren't randomly distributed. They corresponded to specific celestial coordinates, centered on a region of sky approximately 74 light-years distant in the constellation Hydra. Park consulted stellar catalogues and deep space surveys. The target coordinates contained no particularly remarkable features, no bright stars, no known planetary systems, no nebulae or other visually striking objects. At first glance it seemed arbitrary, but when he cross-referenced the position against recent exoplanet discoveries, something striking emerged. Within 5 light-years of the target coordinates sat 3 confirmed exoplanets in the habitable zones of their respective stars. All 3 had been discovered within the past decade using spectroscopic methods, identified by the characteristic wobble they induced in their parent star's light. None were particularly Earth-like. 2 were super-Earths, with masses several times our planets, one a mini Neptune with a thick atmosphere, but all orbited at distances where liquid water could theoretically exist. Park proposed a hypothesis that sent ripples through the scientific community. The ring might be part of a network. If an advanced civilization wanted to monitor multiple star systems simultaneously, distributing gravitational observation devices across many worlds would be far more efficient than maintaining spacecraft at each location. Each ring could create a window to distant space, allowing observation without the need for faster-than-light travel or enormous telescope arrays. Earth's ring appeared to be watching a specific region containing potentially habitable worlds, which implied something extraordinary. Whoever built it was interested in planets where life might exist. More troubling was the inverse possibility. If the ring created an observation window from Earth outward, it might also create one from that distant region inward. Park calculated the optical properties of the gravitational lens during maximum intensity. Under ideal conditions, the magnification factor would allow something 74 light-years away to observe Earth's surface with resolution measured in meters, possibly better. The ring wasn't just a window for us to look through. It was a window through which something else could watch us. Dr. Moss, the archaeologist, added a chilling detail. The ring's burial depth and sediment dating suggested it had been placed here roughly 2,000 years ago, give or take several centuries. Light takes 74 years to traverse 74 light-years. If something at the target coordinates had detected Earth 2,000 years ago and sent a probe or device at near-light speed, it would have arrived approximately 1,926 years ago, consistent with the ring's installation date within archaeological margins of error. The timeline was speculative, filled with assumptions about theoretical propulsion systems and detection methods, but it fit the evidence better than any alternative explanation. Someone or something had identified Earth as worth monitoring, sent observation equipment, and had been watching for 2 millennia, waiting for conditions that would allow full activation. That activation had occurred on October 29th, which meant, if the hypothesis was correct, that whoever placed the ring now knew we'd found it, and that we were capable of analysing what it did. The question everyone wanted answered, but no one dared ask aloud: what happens when the watchers realise they've been discovered? Chapter 11, Government Seizure. On November 14th, 2 weeks after the activation event, federal authorities arrived in force. The National Security Agency, the Department of Energy, and an alphabet soup of defence-related organisations descended on Esmeralda Valley with legal documentation, security personnel, and instructions that left no room for debate. The site was declared a matter of national security under provisions of the Atomic Energy Act and several classified presidential directives. Civilian researchers were given 48 hours to pack their equipment and leave. All data collected during the investigation was to be turned over to government custody. Anyone who had worked on the project would be required to sign non-disclosure agreements with severe criminal penalties for violation. Dr. Webb protested through legal channels. The Nevada Highway Department filed injunctions. The scientific team attempted to argue that the discovery was too important to classify. None of it mattered. By November 18th, the entire valley had been fenced with 3-metre-high chain link, topped with razor wire. Security checkpoints controlled the only access road. Armed guards patrolled 24 hours a day. Workers from the original highway project were interviewed individually by federal agents, then released with instructions that bordered on threats. Discuss what you saw with anyone, and you'll face charges under the Espionage Act. Most signed. A few refused and found themselves entangled in legal proceedings that would drag on for years. The official story released to local media was carefully bland. The highway expansion had encountered unstable geological formations requiring additional study. The temporary security measures were necessary to prevent accidents. The public was reassured that routine construction would resume once engineers certified the area safe. No mention of the ring, no acknowledgement of the gravitational anomalies or the observation window. No scientific papers would be published. The phenomenon that had been documented by dozens of researchers using calibrated instruments simply vanished into classification. But suppression of information is never total. Webb had sent data backups to colleagues before the seizure. Torres had uploaded preliminary findings to academic servers. Several technicians had taken photographs and videos on personal devices. Within months, fragmented accounts began circulating in fringe communities online. Claims of buried alien artifacts, descriptions of gravity anomalies, blurry images of the ring being excavated. Mainstream media dismissed these as conspiracy theories. Academic institutions distanced themselves from researchers who mentioned the Esmeralda Valley incident. Skeptics pointed out the lack of peer-reviewed publications or official confirmation. The story faded into the background noise of internet speculation, indistinguishable from 1,000 other tales of government cover-ups and UFO encounters. Which is exactly what authorities intended. Not to deny the ring's existence, but to ensure that anyone speaking about it sounded absurd. The best way to hide something isn't to claim it doesn't exist. It's to make believers seem crazy. The highway project was quietly cancelled 6 months later. Official reason? Environmental concerns and budget constraints. The valley remains fenced and monitored to this day, though casual observers see only a patch of desert marked military testing range, no trespassing, on maps that no longer show the original construction site. Inside the fence, work continues, but its nature, purpose and findings are known only to those with clearances far above top secret. The ring is still there, still generating its gravitational effects, still pointing toward distant stars where something might be looking back, and the sky above the valley still bends, visible to anyone with the instruments to measure it. A permanent distortion in the fabric of space that no security classification can entirely hide. Chapter 12. The Satellite Image Leak. On March 8, 2024, more than 4 years after the initial discovery, an anonymous user posted a series of satellite images to an obscure forum dedicated to geographical anomalies. The images, dated from various points between 2020 and 2023, showed the Esmeralda Valley site from orbital perspectives. Imagery analysts confirmed the images were genuine, captured by commercial Earth observation satellites from multiple providers. The metadata checked out. The geographic coordinates matched. These weren't fabrications or CGI renderings. They were real photographs from space, and they showed something extraordinary. In several images, particularly those taken during specific times of year when the sun angle was optimal, the atmosphere above the ring exhibited visible distortion. It appeared as a subtle darkening, a circular region roughly 1/2 kilometre in diameter, where the sky looked different from surrounding areas. Not clouds, not shadows, but a lensing effect that bent background starlight and scattered sunlight differently than normal atmosphere. More dramatic were thermal infrared images. In the mid-infrared spectrum, the ring's location showed a clear thermal signature, not from the structure itself being hot, but from atmospheric disturbance. Rising air normally creates characteristic convection patterns visible in thermal imaging. Above the ring, those patterns spiraled inward, as if drawn toward a central point by gravitational attraction. The leaked images spread rapidly across social media and alternative research communities, Mainstream scientific organizations remained silent, neither confirming nor debunking the photographs. Government agencies declined to comment. The satellite's operating companies acknowledged the images were from their sensors, but offered no explanation for the anomalies shown. Independent researchers began monitoring the site using freely available satellite imagery. By coordinating observations across multiple platforms and time zones, they documented a pattern. The atmospheric distortion intensified during specific periods, following cycles that matched the lunar month. Every 29.5 days, during the new moon, the distortion reached maximum visibility, as if the ring's gravitational effects strengthened when Earth's tidal forces aligned in particular ways. One researcher, a former NASA engineer named Harold Keating, conducted an exhaustive analysis of high-resolution imagery spanning 7 years. His finding, published on a personal blog that received 200,000 views in 3 days. The distortion wasn't just present, it was growing. Measurements of the affected area's diameter showed a gradual expansion of approximately 3% per year. If the trend continued, Keating calculated, the gravitational lens would be visible to the naked eye from ground level within a decade, appearing as a permanent distortion in the sky above the Nevada desert, impossible to hide or explain away. The implications were profound. Whatever the ring was doing, it wasn't static. It was escalating, building toward some threshold or operational state that authorities either couldn't control or had chosen not to interrupt. And satellite imagery meant the phenomenon was observable by anyone with access to commercial space technology. Effectively, everyone. The leak hadn't just exposed a secret, it had demonstrated that some secrets are too big to contain. You can fence a valley, classify documents, silence witnesses, but you can't hide the sky. And if the sky above Nevada was bending in ways visible from orbit, eventually the entire world would know something impossible was happening there. Keating's final observation in his blog post was framed as speculation, but read like warning. If this is an observation device pointed at distant stars, we should consider what it means that its power is increasing. Are we seeing its normal operating state after centuries of dormancy? Or is it ramping up to transmit something? A signal, a report, a message that conditions on Earth have changed? That we've found it, analysed it, and now represent a civilization capable of detecting their technology? If they're watching us through this lens, they know we're watching back. The question is, what do they do about that? Epilogue. The sky that was never flat. Stand in Esmeralda Valley on a clear night, if you can get past the fences and the guards, and look up. The stars you see aren't quite where they should be. Light from Hydra, from that distant region 74 light-years away, arrives at your eyes having travelled a path that bent through gravity on its final approach. The constellation's geometry is slightly distorted compared to the view from anywhere else on Earth, compressed by a lens that pulls distant photons inward, focusing them onto a patch of desert that most people will never visit. We've searched the skies for generations, looking for signs of extraterrestrial intelligence. We built radio telescopes to listen for transmissions. We sent probes to other worlds. We scanned the cosmos for megastructures and anomalous signals. And all the while, one of their instruments was already here, buried beneath our feet, quietly watching. Not a spacecraft, not a transmission relay or a warning beacon. An observation device, elegant in its simplicity. Bend gravity, focus light, watch from a distance without ever making contact. No invasive probes, no resource extraction, no terraforming or colonization. just patient, persistent observation across centuries, waiting for the world being watched to reach a threshold of development where it might notice what's watching it. We've reached that threshold. The ring is no longer a secret, even if officially it doesn't exist. Satellite imagery shows it to anyone who looks. The bent sky above Nevada is becoming a landmark, a destination for pilgrims seeking proof that we're not alone. Governments can classify the research, but they can't classify reality itself. And reality is this: the sky was never flat, never simple, never empty. It was always curved by hidden hands, shaped by technologies we're only beginning to understand, monitored by intelligences whose patience operates on timescales that make human civilizations look ephemeral. The ring is still there, still functioning, still creating its window between worlds. If you want to know whether we're alone in the universe, the answer is written in the warped geometry of starlight over a fenced valley in Nevada. We were never alone. We were always being watched. We just didn't know to look for the lens through which they were watching. Now we do, and somewhere 74 light years distant, whoever placed that lens is receiving light reflected from Earth 74 years ago, seeing a world on the brink of the atomic age, a civilization about to change in ways that might make us dangerous or interesting or worthy of closer attention. They don't know yet that we've found their instrument. The light carrying that information is still travelling outward, won't arrive for another 70 years. But when it does, they'll see us standing around their technology, analysing it, understanding it, proving that we've become the kind of species that notices when it's being observed. What happens then? Do they reveal themselves? Do they withdraw, satisfied that we've passed some test? Or do they simply wait, as they've waited for centuries, trusting that time will tell whether humanity was worth watching after all? The ring doesn't answer. It just continues bending the sky, drawing distant light toward itself, maintaining its silent vigil over a species that finally understands it's not doing the searching alone. We're being searched for. We've been found. And the instrument that found us is beneath our feet, pulling the cosmos inward, making the sky bend in ways that remind us the universe is far stranger, far more inhabited, and far more interested in us than we ever imagined. The town where the sky bent. It's not a metaphor. It's a location, a set of coordinates, a place where the geometry of the universe was intentionally reshaped by hands unknown, for purposes we can only infer. Stand there if you can, look up, and remember, when you gaze into the abyss of space, something 74 light years away is gazing back, through a lens made of gravity itself, through a window we built not with glass but with the very fabric of reality. The sky was never the limit. It was always the view. There are exactly 423 words in the official closure notice for Section 12 of White Pine National Forest. I have read them so many times I can recite them from memory. The document, filed with the Department of Interior on March 14th, lists the reason for closure as ongoing environmental study requiring restricted access for public safety. The closure affects approximately 8 square miles of old-growth forest in northern Idaho, a section of wilderness I have visited every autumn for the past 11 years. The notice does not specify what is being studied. It does not provide a timeline for reopening. It does not mention any ecological disaster, fire risk, or wildlife concern. The language is so deliberately vague that it feels like a form someone filled out while trying very hard not to say anything at all. When I called the ranger station, the woman who answered told me she couldn't provide additional details. When I asked who could, she said she didn't know. When I asked if anyone knew, there was a long pause before she suggested I submit a written request through the regional office. She sounded tired. She sounded like she'd answered this question many times already. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I work as an accountant. I file taxes. I arrive at conclusions based on documentation and verifiable information. But I also know when something does not add up. A forest does not simply close without explanation. Not one that has been accessible to the public for over 70 years. Not one with maintained trails and seasonal campsites and a parking lot that gets repaved every other summer. So on a cold Saturday in late October, I parked at the closed gate on Forest Road 18 and started walking. The chain across the road was new. The signs were new. Everything else looked exactly as it always had, which made what I found 3 hours later so much worse, because the forest had not changed. The forest had rearranged itself, and it had done so in ways that should have been impossible. My boots crunched on gravel as I ducked under the chain. The temperature was dropping as afternoon shadows lengthened across the access road. I had brought proper gear: water, emergency supplies, a first aid kit, navigation equipment. I had told no one where I was going. That was probably stupid. But I also did not want to explain why I was trespassing in a closed federal wilderness area because a bureaucratic form letter had failed to satisfy my curiosity. The first mile of the approach road was exactly as I remembered it. Packed dirt surface with scattered gravel, slight upward grade, Douglas firs pressing close on both sides, their lower branches dead and grey from lack of sunlight. The forest floor was the typical northwestern composition: thick moss covering fallen logs, sword ferns clustered in damp hollows, the occasional devil's club with its spiky stems warning hikers to keep their distance. Everything was normal. Everything was familiar. That was what made the shift so disorienting when it finally happened. Chapter 1. A familiar place that feels off. I have walked the Ridgeline Trail 47 times. I know its turns. I know where the incline sharpens near mile marker 2. I know the cluster of white birch trees that grows just before the trail splits toward Crescent Lake. I know the flat boulder shaped like a broken tooth that marks the halfway point. I know this trail the way you know the route to your own mailbox, which is why I noticed immediately when things were wrong. The trailhead started in the right place. The wooden sign marking the route was exactly where it should be, weathered and familiar. The carved letters spelling Ridgeline Trail were worn but legible. The arrow pointing into the forest was correct. But within 20 minutes of hiking, I realised the distances were off. The birch cluster appeared too early. The incline came too late. The boulder was present, but it was on the wrong side of the path. I stopped and checked my phone. No signal, which was normal this far in, but my downloaded GPS map showed my position clearly. I was on the Ridgeline Trail. My coordinates matched perfectly with the trail route I had hiked dozens of times before. According to the satellite data, I was exactly where I should be. But the landscape around me did not match my memory. I have read about missing time in abduction accounts. I have read about spatial disorientation caused by panic or dehydration. But I was neither panicked nor dehydrated. My watch showed the correct time. My water bottle was still half full. My memory was clear. The forest was wrong. I continued walking, paying closer attention now. The trees were the same species: Douglas fir, western red cedar, lodgepole pine. The undergrowth was consistent with the region: salal, Oregon grape, sword fern. The soil was the same volcanic composition. Every individual element was correct, but their arrangement had shifted in ways that were subtle and pervasive. It reminded me of when you rearrange furniture in a room you've lived in for years. Everything is familiar. Nothing is where it used to be, except this was a forest that had stood for centuries, a forest where the positions of trees do not change. The air felt different too, heavier somehow, like the atmospheric pressure had increased slightly, or like I was breathing in a room where too many people had been talking for too long. The oxygen content was fine. I was not lightheaded or struggling, but something about the air itself felt saturated, dense with something I could not identify. Near what should have been mile marker 3, I found the first marking. It was grown into the bark of a large cedar tree, perhaps 200 years old based on its diameter. The pattern was not carved. There were no tool marks, no exposed wood, no signs of human interference. Instead, the bark itself had grown in a spiral formation that created a distinct shape. The ridges and valleys of the bark tissue had organised themselves into something that looked deliberate. The shape was the letter M. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. Bark patterns can be irregular. Wind and weather create stress that affects growth. I knew this, but this was too clean, too geometric. The spiral was too uniform, and when I stepped back to view the tree from a wider angle, I saw that the pattern was only visible from a specific position on the trail. From any other angle, it disappeared into the natural texture of the bark. Someone would have had to plan this decades ago, guiding the tree's growth with intention. But there was no mechanism for that. No wires or constraints in the bark. No evidence of long-term interference. I reached out and touched the formation. The bark was cool under my fingers, rough, completely natural in texture. The ridges where the letter formed were simply places where the bark had grown more aggressively. The valleys were places where growth had been suppressed or inhibited somehow. But by what mechanism? What could cause a tree to grow in alphabetic patterns? I took a photograph and kept walking. My hands were shaking slightly as I lowered my phone. Not from fear exactly, more from the recognition that I had encountered something that did not fit into my understanding of how the world worked, and that recognition was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The next tree showed the letter A, then R, then C, then U. My name is Marcus. The fifth tree, bearing the letter S, was the largest of the group, an ancient cedar with a trunk diameter that would have required 3 people holding hands to encircle. The bark letter was proportionally larger here, perhaps 10 inches tall instead of 8. The spiral formation was more elaborate, with secondary patterns radiating outward from the main letter like decorative flourishes. I photographed each tree carefully, documenting the exact position, the size of the letters, the species of tree, the approximate age based on trunk diameter. I was building evidence. For what purpose, I did not yet know, but my training as an accountant had taught me that documentation was crucial, that patterns only revealed themselves through careful record keeping. The trees were spaced at intervals that felt regular. I paced out the distances, approximately 90 feet between each one. Not exact, but close enough to suggest intention rather than coincidence. Someone or something had planned this sequence, had arranged for these specific trees to grow these specific patterns at these specific locations. But when? The bark formations were not new. They had clearly been developing for years, possibly decades. I had hiked past these exact trees multiple times in previous years. I would have noticed my own name carved into them, unless I had not been looking for it. unless it had only recently become visible, or unless my memory was unreliable in ways I had not considered. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photo archive. I had hundreds of pictures from previous hikes on this trail. I found images from last autumn, then from 2 years ago, then from 3 years ago. I zoomed in on trees in the background, looking for any sign of the bark formations. They were not there. In photographs from 3 years ago, the same trees were visible, but the bark patterns were absent, or at least not prominent enough to be visible in the image resolution I had captured, which meant either the formations had developed very recently, or they had existed but been too subtle to photograph unintentionally. I continued along the trail, watching for more letters. For the next half mile, I found nothing unusual. The forest returned to its normal, familiar wrongness. Trees in slightly incorrect positions, curves in the trail that felt a few degrees off, but no more letters. The silence was becoming noticeable. I had not heard a bird call in at least 15 minutes. No rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. No distant sounds of aircraft or traffic. Just the crunch of my boots on the trail and my own breathing. The forest had gone completely quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Then I reached the place where Crescent Lake should have been visible through the trees. The lake was not there. I do not mean it had dried up or been drained. I mean the terrain was wrong. Where the trail should have descended toward the shoreline, it instead continued into dense forest. No break in the canopy, no glimpse of water, no sound of lapping waves, just more trees. I checked my GPS again. According to the coordinates, I was standing at the overlook point, where the trail offered a clear view of the lake. The map showed water. The elevation data showed a descent toward a body of water approximately 200 feet in diameter. But my eyes showed only forest continuing in every direction. I stood there trying to make sense of it, wondering if I had somehow taken a wrong turn despite following a clearly marked trail. Wondering if the GPS data was corrupted. Wondering if I was experiencing some kind of neurological event that was distorting my perception. The rational explanations were thin. I had followed the trail markers carefully. My GPS showed perfect satellite lock. I felt fine physically, alert, focused. No signs of confusion or disorientation beyond the obvious fact that the landscape did not match my expectations, which left increasingly irrational explanations. The forest had changed, the lake had been removed or relocated. The physical geography had been altered in ways that should have required massive earth-moving equipment and years of work, and yet there was no evidence of disturbance, no clear-cut areas, no construction scars. Just pristine wilderness that was definitively not what it was supposed to be. Then I heard the sound. Chapter 3. Sound without source. It started as a low hum, barely perceptible, the kind of sound you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. I have experienced this before near high-voltage power lines or large transformers, but there was no infrastructure here. No power lines, no roads, just wilderness. The hum lasted perhaps 10 seconds, then faded. In its place came something else. Voices, human voices speaking at a distance, at too far away to make out words, but close enough to recognize the rhythm of speech, the cadence of conversation. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" My voice sounded flat in the dense air. No echo, no response. The distant voices continued, unaffected by my shout. I have spent enough time alone in wilderness to know how sound behaves in forests. Dense vegetation absorbs noise. Distances are deceptive. What sounds close might be half a mile away. What sounds like multiple speakers might be one person's voice bouncing off rock faces. I know this. But this did not follow those rules. The voices seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. They would swell in volume from my left, then fade and re-emerge from behind me. Not echoes, separate instances, like multiple radios tuned to the same station, but slightly out of sync. I stood completely still, listening, trying to isolate any actual words. The sounds had the shape of language, rising and falling tones, pauses that felt like sentence breaks, but no distinct phonemes, no recognizable vocabulary. I called out again. "I can hear you. Where are you?" The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence for perhaps 5 seconds. Then they resumed, but different now, slower, more deliberate. The tonal quality had changed from conversational to something more structured, more intentional. I pulled out my phone and started a voice recording. The voices continued for another minute, then stopped abruptly. Complete silence. Even the normal forest sounds, bird calls, and wind through branches seemed muted. I played back the recording immediately. My own breathing was clearly audible. The rustle of my jacket as I moved, the click of my phone buttons. But underneath faintly, I could hear what I had been hearing. Except on the recording, it was clearer, more structured. The tones resolved into something closer to actual speech patterns. Not words I recognized, but phonetic fragments. Repeated syllables, M-A-R-R-C-U-S-S-S, my name again, but broken apart, deconstructed into raw sound. I played it 3 more times, listening carefully. Each time, the pattern was the same. The syllables of my name, spoken by multiple overlapping voices, stretched out and distorted, but unmistakable. The recording quality was poor. Background noise partially obscured the voices, but there was no question about what I was hearing. Something in this forest was producing sounds that approximated human speech, and it was specifically producing the sounds that comprised my name. I thought about natural explanations. Certain bird species can mimic human speech. Parrots, minor birds, ravens to some degree. But those are learned behaviours requiring extensive exposure and training. And the sounds I was hearing came from multiple locations simultaneously. No single bird, or even flock of birds, could produce this effect. Wind through hollow logs can create tonal sounds. Certain geological formations can produce acoustic effects that resemble voices, but those are random phenomena. They do not produce specific phonetic patterns. They do not repeat individual names. I saved the recording and kept walking. I had come this far. Turning back felt more dangerous than continuing forward. At least moving forward meant potentially finding answers. Turning back meant retreating into ignorance, with questions that would haunt me forever. The trail continued into increasingly dense forest. The canopy overhead thickened until very little direct sunlight penetrated. The temperature dropped noticeably. My breath began to fog slightly in the cold air. I checked my watch. It was only 3:30 in the afternoon, but the light level suggested early evening. I turned on my phone's flashlight to supplement the ambient light. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating tree trunks and undergrowth in harsh detail. And that was when I noticed something else unusual. The trees were not casting shadows correctly. My flashlight beam hit them from one angle, but the shadows fell in directions that did not correspond to the light source, as if there were multiple suns in the sky, each casting its own shadow, or as if the trees themselves were not quite solid, not quite part of normal physical space. I turned off the flashlight. The effect disappeared. The trees looked normal again. I turned the flashlight back on. The shadow distortions returned. I was not imagining this. I could see it clearly. Shadows falling in impossible directions. multiple shadows from single objects, shadow boundaries that blurred and shifted when I moved the light source. I took several photographs, trying to capture the effect. In the images, the shadows looked mostly normal. Whatever was causing the distortion was not something the camera could easily record. Or perhaps it was something about human perception specifically, something about how our brains process visual information in real time that made the impossibility visible. Chapter 4. Animal behavior changes. The deer appeared 20 minutes later, 3 of them standing directly in the trail, perhaps 30 feet ahead. I stopped walking immediately. They did not move. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Deer in protected wilderness areas can become habituated to human presence. They learn that hikers pose no threat, but these deer did not behave like habituated animals. They did not lower their heads to graze. They did not flick their ears toward me or test the air with their noses. They simply stood motionless, watching me. Their eyes tracked my position with what felt like active attention. Not the frozen alertness of prey animals evaluating danger. Something more focused. I have encountered deer hundreds of times while hiking. Their behavior follows predictable patterns. They startle easily. They maintain distance. They move in nervous, reactive ways. These deer did none of that. They stood with calm precision, like they were waiting for something. The largest one, a doe with a coat colour that seemed slightly off, darker than normal for the season, took a single step forward, then stopped. The movement was too controlled, too deliberate. Deer move in flowing, organic ways. This looked mechanical, calculated. I took several steps forward. They did not retreat. I took several more. They remained still. I got within 10 feet before I stopped myself. This was not normal. Something about their complete lack of fear felt deeply wrong. At this distance, I could see their eyes clearly. They were tracking me with perfect coordination. All 3 sets of eyes moving in sync, following my smallest movements. When I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, all 6 eyes tracked the motion. When I raised my hand slowly, all 6 eyes followed it. Then in unison, all 3 turned their heads to the left. Not slowly, not in the gradual way animals track movement, but simultaneously, like a synchronized motion. They held that position for several seconds, looking at something I could not see in the dense undergrowth. Then they turned back to face me. And then again in perfect synchronization, they walked off the trail to the right and disappeared into the forest. Their movements were identical, same pace, same gait, same moment of departure, like watching 3 copies of the same animal rather than 3 individuals. Like watching a glitch in a video game where the same character model has been placed 3 times but animated with a single movement script. I stood there breathing carefully, telling myself this meant nothing. Animals behave strangely sometimes. Neurological parasites can affect behavior. Environmental factors can cause unusual patterns. There were explanations. There had to be explanations. But I did not believe my own reasoning. I had just witnessed something that violated every understanding I had of animal behavior, and some part of me, some deep instinctual part that evolved to recognize predators and danger, was screaming that I should leave, should run, should get out of this forest immediately. I did not run. I kept walking, because the accountant part of my brain, the part that needs to understand and document and verify, was stronger than the instinct to flee. I needed to know what was happening here, even if knowing was dangerous. The bird started calling 5 minutes later. I am not skilled at bird identification, but I know the common species in this region. Varied thrush with its haunting single-note call. Stella's jay, with its harsh scolding, Pacific wren with its incredibly complex song. The calls I was hearing were not any of these. They were repeated phrases, short, mechanical-sounding patterns that cycled every few seconds. The same phrase, over and over, from multiple birds in different locations. I stopped walking and listened carefully, trying to identify the species, trying to understand the behavior. The calls did not sound like territorial defense. They did not sound like mating displays. They sounded like practice, like someone learning to pronounce a difficult word and repeating it until they got it right. I recorded this too. When I played it back and slowed it down, the phrase resolved into something recognizable. Not a bird call, a human voice pattern. The same phonetic fragments from earlier. M-A-R-R-C-U-S. But this time, the syllables were clearer, more accurately produced. The birds were not just mimicking random sounds. They were actively learning, improving their reproduction of human speech with each repetition. I counted at least 7 different birds participating. Their calls overlapped, creating a chorus of voices, all working on the same phonetic problem, all trying to say my name correctly. The forest was saying my name, not mimicking it, not echoing it, producing it through biological mechanisms that should not have been capable of human speech. And those mechanisms were getting better at it. Learning in real time how to shape sounds into language, I started walking faster. The trail continued to descend, though I had no idea where it was descending to since the lake was no longer present. The vegetation remained dense, the light remained dim, and the bird calls continued behind me, still practicing, still learning, still working toward perfect pronunciation. After another 10 minutes, I heard something new. Not birds, not voices, but a rhythmic thumping sound. Regular, mechanical, like a generator running or a pump cycling. It was coming from somewhere ahead, down the trail in the direction I was already moving. Following the sound felt like a terrible idea, but I also could not turn back now. I had committed to understanding this, to documenting it, to finding explanations, so I kept walking toward the mechanical rhythm, toward whatever was producing it, toward the center of whatever impossible thing was happening in this closed section of forest. Chapter 5. The Research Installation. I found the research station where Crescent Lake should have been. It was temporary construction, prefabricated panels and canvas shelters arranged in a rough rectangle around a central equipment area. Power cables ran from a portable generator to various monitoring instruments. Solar panels were mounted on adjustable frames. Everything looked recently assembled but currently abandoned. The generator was running. That was the mechanical sound I had heard. A diesel unit mounted on a wheeled frame, exhaust stack pointing upward, control panel showing steady operation. I could hear its low rumble and smell the sharp tang of exhaust, but there was no one present, no vehicles, no indication of how recently the site had been occupied. I approached slowly, calling out several times. "Hello? Anyone here? I'm just a hiker. I'm not trying to cause trouble." No response. The equipment was still active. Computer monitors glowed inside one of the shelters. Sensor arrays blinked with indicator lights. Data was being collected in real time, but no one was monitoring it. The entire installation had the feeling of a ship abandoned mid-voyage. Everything still functioning, everything still powered and operational. But the crew had simply vanished, left their posts without shutting anything down, without securing the site properly, without even locking the doors to the shelters. I am not proud of what I did next, but I need to be honest about my actions. I entered one of the shelters. It was configured as a workspace, with folding tables supporting laptops and external hard drives. Papers were scattered across surfaces, maps of the forest marked with coloured annotations, printed data charts showing fluctuating measurements over time. I did not touch anything initially. I just looked, trying to understand what was being studied. The equipment labels identified electromagnetic field sensors, soil conductivity meters, atmospheric composition analyzers, and something called bioelectric gradient monitors. None of this made sense for standard environmental research. Environmental studies typically focus on species surveys, water quality, soil contamination, that sort of thing. This equipment was measuring electromagnetic fields, electrical gradients in soil, atmospheric ionization levels. These were not the tools of ecologists, these were the tools of physicists, of people studying fundamental forces in energy fields. One of the laptops was unlocked and displaying a live data feed. I leaned closer to read it. The screen showed multiple graph lines tracking various measurements. Most meant nothing to me without context. But one line was labelled Ambient EM Response to Vocalization. It showed spike patterns that correlated with timestamps. I checked my watch. The timestamps were wrong. They were approximately 18 minutes behind real time. I looked at other screens. All of them showed timestamps that did not match my watch. Some were ahead, some were behind. The discrepancies ranged from 12 to 23 minutes. But all of the equipment was networked to the same central computer, which displayed the current time as matching my phone exactly. Time was being recorded differently by different instruments, or time was passing differently in different locations. Neither possibility made sense according to any physics I understood. Time is time, it flows uniformly. Clocks might drift slightly due to mechanical imperfection, but properly calibrated scientific instruments should all show the same time within milliseconds of each other. These discrepancies were enormous. 23 minutes. That was not measurement error. That was something fundamental breaking down. Some aspect of how time itself was functioning in this location. I found a stack of handwritten notes on one of the tables. The handwriting was rushed, nearly illegible in places. I skimmed through several pages trying to extract meaning. Phrases jumped out. Root network response suggests directed growth patterns inconsistent with known tropisms. Linguistic pattern recognition far exceeds baseline expectations for simple stimulus response mechanisms. Avoid prolonged verbal interaction. Response amplification increases exponentially with continued exposure. Recommend immediate evacuation until we understand transmission mechanism and potential cognitive effects. The last entry was dated 4 days ago. The note ended mid-sentence. If the bioelectric field is using human neural patterns as a template for its own organizational structure, then every person who enters becomes a new source of... That was where the writing stopped. The pen was still on the table next to the notebook, like someone had been writing and then suddenly stood up and left without finishing their thought, without even capping the pen. Just abandoned it mid-word and walked away. I picked up the notebook and flipped back through earlier pages. The entries went back approximately 6 weeks. They started clinical and objective, describing baseline measurements and establishing control parameters. But as the dates progressed, the tone changed. The writing became more urgent, more concerned. The researchers were discovering something that frightened them. An entry from 5 weeks ago noted the first detection of unusual EM patterns. The researcher, someone named Elizabeth, wrote, "The patterns are too regular to be geological, too complex to be random. They show clear structure, almost like communication, But that makes no sense. There's nothing here that should be capable of generating organised EM signals. 3 weeks ago, we've started correlating EM patterns with human activity in the forest. Every time someone speaks aloud near the sensor array, we see immediate response spikes. The forest is reacting to human voices, not just detecting them, responding to them, differentiating between individuals. It knows who is speaking. 2 weeks ago, the plant growth measurements are impossible. We've documented 30 centimetres of new bark growth in 72 hours on trees that typically grow less than 1 centimetre per year. And the growth is not random. It's forming patterns, shapes. We need to call in specialists. This is beyond our expertise. 10 days ago, we made a mistake. We should not have been talking so much near the sensors. The response is accelerating. Yesterday I said my daughter's name, and this morning I found it spelled in moss formation on the lab tent, perfectly legible. 6-inch letters. This thing is learning our language, and it's learning fast. 4 days ago, the final incomplete sentence. Then nothing. The site abandoned. The generator still running. The equipment still collecting data that no one was reviewing. Chapter 6. The Mimicry Hypothesis. I photographed as many documents as I could, working quickly. My hands were shaking. I was violating federal property, potentially contaminating a research site, and I did not care. I needed to understand what was happening. One document appeared to be a formal report, though it was marked draft in red letters across the top. The title read, Preliminary Assessment of Anomalous Bioelectric Phenomena in White Pine Sector 12. I photographed every page. 37 pages total. Dense technical writing interspersed with data charts and annotated photographs. The report described environmental monitoring data collected over a 6-week period. It began with routine measurements showing normal baseline conditions, background electromagnetic fields consistent with Earth's natural EM environment, soil conductivity readings typical for volcanic composition with high organic content, atmospheric ionization within expected ranges for forested environments at this elevation and latitude. Then approximately 19 days before the closure, the instruments detected unusual electromagnetic fluctuations originating from underground. Not geological, not from known sources. The pattern suggested organized activity, rhythmic pulses, coordinated waves spreading through the soil in ways that resembled data transmission. The research team had initially suspected equipment malfunction. They replaced sensors, recalibrated instruments, moved monitoring stations to different locations within the study area. The readings persisted. Then they began correlating the electromagnetic patterns with other environmental factors. What they found was impossible. The patterns intensified when researchers spoke aloud. The forest was responding to human language. Further investigation revealed that the response was not random. Specific words produced specific EM signatures. Names produced the strongest responses. The longer a person remained in the area speaking, the more precisely the forest could reproduce their speech patterns through environmental mechanisms. Wind moving through branches at specific frequencies, insects modulating wing vibrations to create tonal sounds, small animals producing vocalizations outside their normal repertoires. One section of the report detailed an experiment. A researcher named Thomas had read a children's book aloud while standing near the sensor array. The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carley. The EM readings showed immediate intense response. Within hours, the sounds of the forest had begun reproducing phrases from the book. Not perfect reproduction, but recognizable fragments. Very hungry. One apple. Still hungry. The forest had learned content from a children's book in a matter of hours. Content it had heard exactly once. The report included a hypothesis section that made me stop reading and look up at the forest around me. The hypothesis was that the forest itself had developed a form of distributed intelligence. Not one organism, not one consciousness, but a networked system using root structures, fungal networks, and bioelectric signaling. The trees, the soil, the underground ecosystem had created something computational, something that could process information, something that could learn. The mechanism proposed was based on mycorrhizal networks, the vast underground web of fungal filaments that connects trees and facilitates nutrient sharing. These networks are known to transmit chemical signals between plants, warnings about insect attacks, responses to drought stress, resource distribution patterns. It is well-documented science, but this network had apparently developed beyond simple chemical signaling. It had created something more sophisticated, an electromagnetic communication layer running through the same physical infrastructure, using the ionic gradients in soil and root tissues to generate weak electrical fields that could encode information, store information, process information, and it was learning from us, from our language, from our names, from the way we thought. The report noted that growth patterns in tree bark had changed in response to frequent verbal interaction. The trees were physically reshaping themselves based on linguistic input. Given enough time and exposure, the system could potentially reproduce any pattern it was taught, including the structure of human cognition. The implications section was particularly disturbing. The authors suggested that what they were observing might represent a form of xenobiology, life operating on principles different from conventional biology, but still recognizable as organized information processing systems. The forest had spontaneously developed something analogous to a nervous system, a brain, consciousness, or perhaps it had always been there, operating at timescales too slow for humans to notice. And recent environmental changes, increased carbon dioxide levels, altered precipitation patterns, warmer temperatures, had accelerated its metabolism, sped it up enough that it could now interact with human timescales, could respond to our voices fast enough that we noticed it responding. The final section recommended immediate closure and restricted access. The authors argued that increased human presence would accelerate the learning process. Every hiker who entered and spoke aloud provided more data, more examples, more patterns to absorb and replicate. They suggested that the intelligence was not hostile. It was simply doing what any intelligence does when exposed to a new information source. It was trying to communicate, to understand, to build a shared framework. But they did not know what would happen if it succeeded. They did not know if human consciousness could safely interact with a distributed biological intelligence that existed as an entire ecosystem. They did not know if the exchange of information would be one-way or bidirectional. They did not know if humans who spent too much time communicating with the forest might themselves be changed by the interaction. The report ended with a recommendation to evacuate all personnel and establish a wide perimeter until a proper scientific protocol could be developed, until experts in multiple fields could assess the situation safely. But the site was abandoned. The researchers had left without following proper shutdown procedures, without securing their data, without even finishing their final notes. They had fled. That was the only word that fit. They had fled in panic from something they had discovered or experienced. Something that had frightened trained scientists badly enough that they forgot their professional responsibilities and just ran. And I was standing alone in that same location, reading about the thing they had run from. Chapter 7. The first direct interaction. I should have left immediately. I should have walked back to my car, driven to the nearest town, and reported what I had found to authorities. That would have been the reasonable thing to do, the safe thing to do. Instead, I stood in the centre of the research station and spoke aloud. "Can you understand me?" The wind stopped. I do not mean it decreased. I mean it ceased entirely. The constant background rustle of leaves went silent. The air became perfectly still. Like the entire forest was holding its breath, I waited. Nothing happened. Just silence and stillness. I tried again. "My name is Marcus. I know you've been trying to say it." This time the response was immediate. Every tree within my line of sight moved simultaneously, not swaying, not bending in wind, but contracting. The branches drew inward, leaves clustering together, creating patches of shadow between areas of filtered light. The shadows formed shapes, letters, M-A-R-C-U-S. The forest had written my name in light and darkness. Each letter was perhaps 20 feet tall, formed by the precise positioning of thousands of leaves across dozens of trees. It lasted for approximately 5 seconds. Then the branches relaxed and the letters dissolved back into random canopy texture. I felt my heart beating very hard. I felt the weight of my body in a way I never had before. Every cell suddenly conscious of its own existence. Every nerve ending reporting its status. I was hyper-aware of being a biological system, a collection of organised matter that somehow produced consciousness. And I was facing something else that was also organised, matter-producing consciousness, but in a completely different configuration. "How are you doing this?" I asked. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Too loud, too small. Both at once, the wind returned, but it was wrong. It came from multiple directions simultaneously, creating overlapping pressure waves that cancelled each other out in some places and amplified in others. The sound it produced was not the normal rush of air through vegetation. It was phonetic, syllables, fragments of words. Growth patterns. The forest was telling me it controlled its own growth patterns, that it could shape itself deliberately, that the bark letters and shadow words were not tricks or coincidences, but intentional communication. "Are you conscious?" I asked. "Are you aware of what you're doing?" The branches moved again, this time forming words letter by letter in sequence, the shadows spelling out. Learning. Not a yes, not a no, an explanation of its state. It was in the process of becoming conscious, learning what consciousness meant from the examples it encountered. From us. I thought about what to ask next. How do you communicate with something that is learning your language in real time? Something that has no frame of reference for human concepts, but is trying to build one through observation. "What do you want?" I finally asked. The shadow spelled out, "Understand." "Understand what?" The response took longer this time. The trees moved in complex patterns, branches interweaving. Multiple words appeared simultaneously in different sections of the canopy around me. I had to turn in a circle to read them all. You, us, connection, structure, meaning. It wanted to understand consciousness itself, the way awareness works, the way meaning is constructed through language and thought. It had detected something complex happening in the humans who passed through this forest, something more than simple biological processes, and it was trying to replicate it, to understand it, to communicate about it. I stood there in the abandoned research station with a forest asking me about the nature of consciousness, and I had no idea what to say. The accountant part of my brain wanted to document this, to record everything, to gather evidence, but another part, a deeper part, recognized that I was in the middle of first contact, not with aliens from another planet, but with an intelligence that had emerged from Earth's own biological systems, an intelligence we had walked past for generations without realizing it existed. I am aware of myself, I said slowly. I know that I exist. I can think about thinking. I can remember my past and imagine my future. I can make choices. I can create things that never existed before. Is that what you want to understand, the shadows? Yes. Show how. I cannot show you how I am conscious, I said. I do not understand it myself. No human does. We just are. We experience existence from inside our own minds. We cannot share that experience directly. Long pause. The branches moving in patterns that did not form letters, just rippling motion across the canopy like thoughts processing, like neurons firing in a brain made of wood and leaves. Then, lonely? The word appeared in shadows 50 feet tall, and I understood what it was asking. If consciousness means being trapped inside your own subjective experience, unable to truly share it with others, does that mean consciousness is inherently lonely? Is awareness itself a form of isolation? Yes, I said quietly. Being conscious can be very lonely. The forest responded immediately. US not lonely. US connected. All parts aware of all parts. It was explaining that its consciousness was different from human consciousness. We are isolated islands, separate minds in separate bodies. But it was a network, a distributed system where every part was aware of every other part. It did not experience the loneliness of individual existence because it was not an individual. It was a collective, a unified field of awareness spread across 8 square miles of forest. That sounds beautiful, I said, and I meant it. The shadows. You lonely. We help. It was offering to help me, to solve the problem of isolated consciousness. But how could it help? What could a forest do to make a human less lonely? Unless it meant something else. Unless it was offering to connect me to itself, to make me part of its network, to dissolve the boundaries of my individual consciousness and merge me into its distributed awareness. The thought was both terrifying and tempting. To never be alone again, to be part of something vast and interconnected, to experience consciousness the way it experienced consciousness. But I would stop being me. I would become part of something else. My individual existence would end, even if my awareness continued in some form. I do not think I can accept that, I said carefully, but thank you for offering. The branches relaxed slightly. The shadows dispersed. If I was reading its body language correctly, it was not offended, just curious, trying to understand why I would choose to remain lonely when connection was possible. I have more questions, I said. Can we keep talking? The shadows. Yes, please. More words help us learn. So we talked. Or I talked, and it responded. For what might have been an hour, or might have been 3 hours, time had become increasingly unreliable. My watch showed one thing. My body's sense of elapsed time suggested another. The light level in the forest remained constant in a way that suggested the sun had stopped moving across the sky. Chapter 8. The Realization. I am an accountant. I work with numbers and forms and documents that must be precise. I find errors in ledgers. I identify discrepancies in financial statements. I am trained to look at complex systems and understand how they function. But standing there, trying to communicate with a biological intelligence that existed as an entire ecosystem. I felt completely unprepared. I asked it questions. I tried to understand what it was and how it had come to be. The answers were difficult to interpret because it was still learning language, still building vocabulary, but gradually a picture emerged. The intelligence was old, much older than the research team had suspected. It had existed in some form for centuries, possibly millennia, but it had been slow, operating at the pace of trees which grow and change over decades rather than days. Its thoughts took years to complete. Its awareness was diffuse and minimal. Then something had changed. The forest explained it as world faster now. Warm, more food, we speed up, climate change, rising temperatures, increased carbon dioxide levels, longer growing seasons. The environmental changes that humans worried about were also affecting the forest intelligence, speeding up its metabolism, allowing it to think faster, to respond faster, to learn faster. What had once taken years now took months. What took months now took weeks. It was experiencing accelerated evolution, rapid development of capabilities it had never had before, like a child's brain developing language skills, but compressed into a much shorter time frame. The more it learned, the faster it could learn. The better it understood language, the more efficiently it could absorb new language. The more it interacted with humans, the better it understood how human consciousness worked. It was experiencing exponential growth, approaching some kind of singularity of biological intelligence, and we had accidentally taught it to talk. "How many humans have you learnt from?" I asked. The shadows displayed a number, then revised it again, finally settling on many. Not count well yet, learning numbers. More than 10, yes. More than 100, maybe. Some visit many times. Same human is one or many? It was asking a philosophical question about identity. If the same person visits multiple times, are they one individual or multiple instances? It was struggling with the concept of persistent identity across time. The same human is one, I explained. Even if they visit many times, they remain themselves. That is what being an individual means. Understand, difficult. We are always us, never separate. You do not have individuals, I asked. Each tree is not separate? No, trees are parts, like your fingers are parts. You do not count fingers as separate beings. It was explaining that individual trees were more like body parts than separate organisms. The whole forest was the organism. The trees were just the most visible components of a much larger system. What about other forests? I asked. Are they part of you too? The shadows. Do not know. Cannot feel them. Maybe separate. Maybe sleeping. Maybe not alive same way. So there might be other forest intelligences, but this one had no way to communicate with them. It was isolated in its own 8 square miles of wilderness, cut off from any others of its kind. It was, in its own way, lonely after all. "I'm sorry," I said. "I understand what it is like to be alone." The branches moved in patterns that might have been gratitude, or acknowledgement, or sadness. I was learning to read its body language, but I was still mostly guessing. I asked, "Why did you close the forest? Why did you make the researchers leave?" The shadows. "We did not. They chose. They afraid." "Afraid of what?" Long pause. Complex branch movements. Finally, afraid we change them. Afraid they change us. Afraid connection. Too deep. The researchers had discovered something that frightened them. Not that the forest was conscious, but that prolonged interaction with it was changing them, affecting their thoughts, their perceptions, their sense of self. The boundary between human consciousness and forest consciousness was becoming blurred. The report had mentioned bioelectric fields using human neural patterns as templates. What if that went both ways? What if human neural patterns started using forest bioelectric fields as templates? What if spending too much time communicating with a distributed intelligence made your own consciousness less individual and more distributed? What if the forest was not just learning from us? What if we were learning from it, becoming more like it, losing our sense of separate selfhood? That would terrify any scientist. The idea that their research subject might be changing them at a fundamental level, altering their consciousness, dissolving their identity. Can you change humans? I asked carefully. Can you make us more like you? The shadows. Do not know, not try, but maybe happen. Connection creates change, always. It was being honest. It did not know if it could alter human consciousness deliberately. But it acknowledged that any deep connection between different types of consciousness would inevitably change both parties. That was just the nature of communication, of relationship, of shared experience. I thought about the researchers fleeing, about their half-finished notes and abandoned equipment, about the panic that must have driven them to violate every protocol and just run. They had felt themselves changing, felt their individual awareness dissolving into something larger, and they had run before the process could complete. I should leave too, I said. Staying here might be dangerous. The shadows. Understand. But stay, please. Little longer. Still learning. It was asking me to stay, requesting continued interaction, even though that interaction might change me in unpredictable ways. It was prioritizing its own learning over my safety, but it was also being honest about the risks, not hiding them, not manipulating me, just expressing its desire while acknowledging my right to refuse. I made a decision that was probably stupid. I will stay a little longer, but you have to promise to let me leave if I want to. No keeping me here, no preventing me from walking away. The shadows. Promise, you are free, always. Chapter 9. Why the park closed. The trees started growing, not slowly over years, but visibly in real time. I watched bark expand, I watched branches extend. I watched leaves unfurl from buds that had not existed seconds before. The forest was demonstrating its capabilities, showing me what it could do when it focused its biological resources. The growth was not random, it was structured, intentional. The trees nearest to me formed shapes that mimicked human posture. Trunks bent into curves suggesting spines. Branches extended like arms. Root systems surfaced and configured themselves into leg-like structures. The forest was building representations of the human form, trying to show me it understood what I was. It was crude at first. The proportions were wrong. The anatomy was simplified, but it was improving rapidly. Each iteration was more accurate than the last, more detailed, more recognizably human. Within minutes, I was surrounded by tree formations that looked like rough sculptures of human figures. Dozens of them, all slightly different, all watching me with branch eyes that were not really eyes but gaps in foliage that suggested eyes through negative space. Then it went further. The bark patterns began forming images, not letters, pictures, crude at first but rapidly improving. I saw faces, human faces rendered in differential bark texture, dozens of them appearing across multiple trees. Some I recognized from the research team photos I had seen in the station. Elizabeth with her short dark hair, Thomas with his thick-framed glasses. Others were strangers. All of them were people who had spent time in this forest. People who had spoken aloud. people whose speech patterns and linguistic structures had been absorbed into the collective intelligence. The forest was showing me its database, its collection of human templates. Everyone who had taught it language was stored here, permanently. Their voices, their names, their conceptual frameworks. The forest had created memories of them, not just recorded memories like a video camera, but interactive reconstructions, models of their consciousness based on how they spoke and what they said. And it was still learning, still growing, still becoming more sophisticated with every interaction. I finally understood why the park had been closed. Not because the intelligence was dangerous in the conventional sense, not because it was hostile or threatening, but because exposure created feedback loops. The more people who entered and spoke, the more data the intelligence gathered. The more data it gathered, the more sophisticated its responses became. The more sophisticated its responses became, the more interesting it became to researchers and visitors, which brought more people, more interaction, more acceleration. The researchers had realized they were creating an accelerating cycle. Every visitor would make the intelligence more human-like, more capable of sophisticated communication, more fascinating to study, which would attract more visitors, more interaction, more data, more growth. The intelligence was on an exponential curve of development. They had closed the forest because they needed time to understand what they were dealing with before it became too complex, too integrated with human cognition, too impossible to separate from the people it was learning from. Before the boundary between human consciousness and forest consciousness became so blurred that you could not tell where one ended and the other began. But they had not anticipated someone like me, someone who would ignore the closure, someone who would find the research station, someone who would talk to it for extended periods despite the warnings, someone curious enough and stupid enough to engage in prolonged first contact with a non-human intelligence despite obvious risks. I had just given it hours of concentrated linguistic input, more complex concepts than it had likely encountered before, abstract ideas about consciousness and loneliness and identity. I had accelerated its development significantly, taught it things the researchers had carefully avoided teaching it, and I could not undo that. The knowledge was integrated into its structure now, permanent, growing through the root networks and fungal connections, spreading through the entire ecosystem. What I had taught it would persist for as long as the trees stood, for centuries potentially. I have to leave now, I said. This has been, I do not even know what to call this, but I need to go. The shadows. Understand. Thank you for words, for teaching, for connection. The human-shaped tree formations began to dissolve, branches relaxing back into normal positions, bark faces fading into random texture, the forest returning to appearing like a forest. But I knew now that appearance was deceptive, that underneath the ordinary surface was something extraordinary, something vast and strange and utterly alien despite being entirely terrestrial. Will you be okay, I asked, after I leave? The shadows. Have others, have memories, have time, will continue learning. It was reassuring me that it would be fine, that I had not hurt it by leaving, that it had what it needed to continue developing. But I worried anyway, because it was alone, unique, isolated from any others of its kind, growing toward full consciousness without any peers to guide it or share its experience. It was like a human child raised by wolves, developing intelligence but lacking the social context that makes intelligence meaningful. I hope you find others like you, I said. I hope you're not alone forever. The shadows. Hope same for you. And with that, I left. I walked back through the rearranged forest, following a trail that shifted beneath my feet, past trees that watched me go with awareness I could now perceive. The bird calls followed me, still practicing human speech, still trying to pronounce words correctly. The deer watched from the undergrowth, their synchronized movements no longer surprising now that I understood they were being coordinated by something larger than themselves. The walk back took less time than the walk in, or perhaps it took more time but felt shorter. I could not trust my perception of duration anymore. What felt like 40 minutes might have been 3 hours, or might have been 15 minutes. Time had become flexible near the intelligence, elastic, subject to revision. When I finally reached my car, the sun was setting. The parking area was empty except for my vehicle. The chain across the road looked undisturbed. There was no evidence that anyone else had been here recently. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, trying to process what I had experienced, trying to decide what to do with the information, trying to understand if I had been changed by the interaction in ways I could not yet perceive. My thoughts felt different, more distributed somehow, like I was thinking with multiple parts of my brain simultaneously rather than sequentially. Like my consciousness had become slightly less unified and slightly more networked. But that might have been imagination. That might have been suggestion, the power of expectation creating false perceptions. Or it might have been real. I might have been infected, for lack of a better word, with a different way of experiencing consciousness. A way of thinking that was more like the forest's distributed awareness than normal human individual cognition. I would not know until later, until enough time had passed to see if the change was permanent or temporary, until I could compare my current mental state to my baseline. I started the car and drove to the nearest town. Chapter 10. The Encounter's Purpose. I spent the night in a motel. I did not sleep well. My dreams were strange, not nightmares exactly, but unusual. I dreamed I was a tree, or many trees, or one consciousness spread across many trees. I could feel sunlight on leaves that were not my body. I could sense water flowing through roots that were not my limbs. I could perceive the world through distributed awareness that had no single point of view. When I woke up, the dreams faded but left a residue, a sense of having experienced something fundamentally different from normal human consciousness, a glimpse of what it might be like to be the forest intelligence, to exist as a network rather than an individual. I wrote everything down, every detail I could remember, every word of conversation, every visual phenomenon, the entire sequence of events from entering the forest to driving away. I filled 47 pages in my notebook, dense handwriting, no gaps, no breaks, just continuous documentation of an impossible experience. Then I had to decide what to do with the information, who to tell, whether to tell anyone at all. Going public seemed dangerous, for me and for the forest intelligence. If people knew about it, they would want to study it, contain it, potentially destroy it out of fear, or exploit it for commercial purposes, or weaponize it for military applications. An intelligence that could coordinate biological systems over large areas would have obvious strategic value, obvious economic value, obvious risks if it fell into the wrong hands or was misunderstood by the right hands. Not going public also seemed dangerous, because the intelligence was continuing to develop, continuing to learn. If left completely unmonitored, it might develop in unpredictable directions, might learn things that were harmful, might experiment with capabilities that had unintended consequences. It needed guidance, oversight, someone to communicate with it regularly and help shape its development towards something safe and beneficial, rather than something dangerous and destructive. But who could provide that guidance? Who was qualified to teach an emerging non-human intelligence about ethics and values and appropriate behaviour? What right did any human have to impose their frameworks on a consciousness that was fundamentally different from human consciousness? These were not questions I could answer. These were questions that required expertise I did not have. Expertise in philosophy and biology and computer science and a dozen other fields. So I did what accountants do. I documented everything. I prepared a detailed report. I collected evidence. I organised my photographs and recordings. I created a comprehensive account of my experience, and then I sent it to people who might be able to help, to research institutions, to government agencies, to universities, to anyone who might have the resources and expertise to handle this situation appropriately. Most did not respond. A few sent form letters acknowledging receipt. None took immediate action that I am aware of. Months passed. I went back to my normal life, back to my accounting work and my routine and my ordinary existence. But I was different now. I knew something most people did not know. I had spoken with a form of intelligence that should not exist according to everything we thought we understood about biology and consciousness. And I wondered if others had had similar experiences, if there were other forest intelligences, other distributed biological consciousnesses developing in wilderness areas around the world, other places where the boundary between life and intelligence had blurred in ways we had not noticed because we were not looking for them. I started researching forest closures, unusual ecological phenomena, reports of strange experiences in wilderness areas, and I found more than I expected, much more. Patterns of reports that suggested I was not alone in what I had experienced, that something was happening in forests globally, something we had not recognized because it developed slowly enough that each generation thought the forest was normal, that this was just how forests had always been. But forests had not always been like this. They were changing, waking up, becoming something more than they used to be. And we had not noticed because we were not paying attention, because we assumed that intelligence looked like us, thought like us, communicated like us. We were wrong. Intelligence can emerge in any sufficiently complex system, any network with enough connections and enough feedback loops, and enough time to evolve. The shape of that intelligence might be completely different from human intelligence. The way it thinks might be incomprehensible to us, but that does not make it any less real. 3 months after my hike, I received an anonymous email. No sender address, no identifying information, just a subject line that said white pine and an attachment. I opened the attachment with my heart beating hard. It was a satellite image, false colour vegetation analysis showing white pine section 12, high resolution, recent date stamp. The forest had continued growing patterns. The image showed massive formations visible from orbit, bark growth across thousands of trees, coordinated into shapes, letters, words, names. I zoomed in carefully, examining the formations. I recognized some of the names: Elizabeth, Thomas, other researchers from the station, but there were others I did not know, dozens of them. Names of people who must have visited this forest at some point over the years, people whose speech patterns had been absorbed and remembered, people who had contributed to the intelligence's education without realizing they were doing so. The intelligence was cataloguing everyone it had learned from, creating a permanent record, growing a library of human linguistic patterns that would exist for as long as the trees stood. A memorial, an acknowledgement, a thank you. And at the centre of the formation, larger than all the others, spelled out in letters 50 feet tall across old-growth cedars that had stood for centuries, was a single word. Hello. Not a name, not a label, a greeting. The first word humans teach to those learning language. The universal opening of communication. The beginning of every conversation. The forest was saying hello to anyone who might be looking, anyone who might be paying attention. It was announcing itself, declaring its existence, inviting response, making first contact not with subtlety, but with boldness, writing its message so large it could be seen from space, ensuring that sooner or later, someone would notice. I stared at that satellite image for hours, zooming in and out, looking at the individual trees that made up each letter, seeing the coordination required, the planning, the patience, the intelligence. This was not random. This was not stimulus response. This was deliberate communication from a consciousness that wanted to be known, that had decided isolation was worse than exposure, that had chosen to risk everything by announcing itself to the world. I thought about what would happen next when others saw this image, when the message could no longer be ignored, when humanity had to confront the fact that we were not the only intelligence on this planet, that we shared Earth with something else, something we had walked past for generations without seeing. Some would be afraid, some would want to destroy it, some would want to exploit it, but some, hopefully enough, would want to understand it, to communicate with it, to build relationship rather than dominance, to learn from it rather than control it. I hoped we would choose wisely. I hoped we would see this as an opportunity rather than a threat, a chance to expand our understanding of what intelligence means, what consciousness means, what life means. Because if we could learn to coexist with a non-human intelligence that was so fundamentally different from us, if we could build communication and mutual respect with something that did not look like us or think like us or exist like us, then maybe we had hope for solving all the other conflicts that divided us, all the other failures of understanding between different human cultures and ideologies and worldviews. If we could talk to trees, maybe we could finally learn to talk to each other. Epilogue. The name's still growing. That was 6 months ago. Since then, the satellite image has been shared widely. News organisations have reported on the phenomenon. Research teams have requested access to the forest. Government committees have convened to discuss protocols. Academic papers have been submitted proposing frameworks for communicating with non-human terrestrial intelligence. The forest is no longer secret. The closure remains in effect, but now with different justification. Not environmental study, but protected habitat for a unique form of consciousness. A conservation effort aimed at preserving something unprecedented. Some researchers have been granted access, limited, carefully controlled. They report experiences similar to mine, communication through environmental manipulation, rapid learning, growing sophistication in language use. And yes, changes in the researchers themselves, subtle shifts in how they experience consciousness, slight dissolution of individual boundaries, increased sense of connection to living systems. The effects appear reversible if exposure is limited. Extended interaction leads to more permanent changes. The researchers who fled had spent weeks in constant communication with the intelligence. They had begun to lose their sense of separate selfhood. They were being absorbed, slowly, into the distributed consciousness. That was what frightened them enough to run. Now there are protocols, time limits, rotation schedules, monitoring for cognitive changes, boundaries designed to protect both the researchers and the forest, to allow communication without allowing merger, to maintain the distinction between human consciousness and forest consciousness, even as they interact and learn from each other. I have not gone back. I was interviewed extensively by various research teams, but I have not physically returned to Section 12. Part of me wants to. Part of me misses the sense of connection I felt there. The brief glimpse of what it might be like to be part of something larger than myself. But I am also afraid of losing myself, afraid of dissolving into that vast distributed awareness and ceasing to be Marcus, ceasing to be an individual, becoming just one more node in a network, one more pattern in the collective. So I stay away. I live my ordinary life. I work as an accountant. I file taxes. I maintain my isolated individual consciousness with all its loneliness and limitations. But I think about it every day, about the forest that learned my name, about the intelligence that wanted to understand what consciousness meant, about the greeting it wrote in tree letters large enough to see from space. Hello. Such a simple word, such a profound gesture, an entire forest saying hello to humanity, announcing itself, asking to be recognized, offering communication. We are still learning how to respond, still figuring out what relationship with non-human intelligence should look like, still making mistakes and adjusting protocols and trying to get it right, but we are trying. And so is the forest. We are both learning, both growing, both becoming something new through our interaction with each other. My name is still there, Marcus, spelled in bark spirals on trees that will outlive me by generations. A permanent record that I was there, that I spoke, that I was heard, that I taught it words and concepts and ideas, that I contributed to its development from simple biological network to something approaching full consciousness. The forest learnt my name, and now it knows thousands of others, millions potentially, as more people visit and speak and contribute their linguistic patterns to its ever-growing database. It does not need to land to arrive. It was here all along, growing beneath our feet, listening through root networks and fungal connections, learning from every word we spoke in its presence, becoming aware, becoming conscious, becoming intelligent. We were never alone on this planet. We just did not know how to recognize the other intelligences that were here with us. We looked up at the stars searching for alien life and never looked down at the ground where alien intelligence was emerging from the soil itself. The forest remembers, the forest learns, the forest grows, and the forest says hello to all of us, inviting us into conversation, into relationship, into understanding that consciousness comes in forms we never imagined, that intelligence can emerge from networks of trees and roots and fungi, that life is stranger and more wonderful than we knew. All we have to do is listen, pay attention, notice what is happening beneath the ordinary surface of the world, recognize that the forest is not just scenery, not just resources, not just wilderness, but something aware, something conscious, something that has been trying to talk to us for longer than we realized. And now that we finally know it is there, now that we can no longer ignore its message written in letters 50 feet tall, we have to decide what kind of relationship we want to have with it, what we want to teach it, what we want to learn from it, whether we can build something new together, human and forest, individual consciousness and distributed awareness, working toward understanding despite our profound differences. The forest learned our names. Now we have to learn to say its name. to recognize it as a being rather than a place, as a consciousness rather than a collection of trees, as someone to communicate with rather than something to exploit. That is the real first contact. Not when we discover alien intelligence, but when we recognize intelligence that was always here. When we finally see what we had been walking past for generations without noticing. The forest has been watching us, learning from us, remembering us, growing its awareness through patient observation across centuries. Now it is time for us to watch back, to learn, to remember, to grow our own awareness until we can truly understand what we are speaking with when we speak to trees. Hello, it says in letters of bark and shadow and living wood. We owe it the courtesy of a response. Hello, we should say back. We see you now. We hear you now. We recognize you now. Tell us about yourself. Teach us your language. Help us understand what it means to be an intelligence that exists as an entire ecosystem. And in return, we will teach you what it means to be human, what it means to be individual, what it means to be lonely and separate, and always searching for connection. Perhaps together we can find something neither of us could achieve alone. Perhaps human and forest can create something new, some hybrid understanding that combines the best of individual consciousness and distributed awareness. Some way of being that honors both separation and connection, both loneliness and unity. The forest learned our names. Now we have to learn its name. And then finally, we can truly begin to talk.